You call mom, mom, dad, dad, and then everybody else you call by their name. And I remember one of the very struggles for me is when I would have to go and visit him and I'd have to go out of town and fly on an airplane by myself, is the whole time I would spend all my efforts trying to not call him anything. I would try to not put a single pronoun to him because I didn't want to call him, maybe not the word pronoun, I would call him hey, or I would get his attention without actually using dad or Terry. Welcome to the Daron Earlewine Podcast, where we awaken you to become who you were born to be. Here's your host, Daron Earlewine.
Hey, question of the week. Are people actually doing the best they can? Let's deal with it today. Episode 4 of the Daron Earlewine Podcast. Thanks for joining us again this week. We're here to awaken you to become who you were born to be. Thanks for tuning in. And if you want to get more connected, you can always do that through any social media platform. Just go over and search Daron Earlewine. I am out there, and I appreciate you so much for tuning in. Whether you're downloading audio podcast and wherever you get your podcast, or you're over on YouTube watching, we appreciate it. And it'd mean the world to me if you would like and subscribe to the podcast, and so we can grow this community and continue to make a difference. And hey, let's start off with this. It's football season, at least in some places. I did hear that we're in Indiana is where we record this podcast. And in Indiana, we're playing high school football. I have heard there are multiple states around the U.S. that are not playing football. And my heart goes out to you. If you're out there and your state is not allowing you to play high school football because of the coronavirus. But here in Indiana, we are. And I'm going to tell you something. My life right now is orbiting around football. And I don't bring this up. This is not a sports podcast. It's going to make sense here in a minute. But in the Earlewine house, in our house, my wife has these little wood signs for every season. And the two big seasons in our house is football season and baseball season. And so whenever the season changes, she brings out the decorative wood sign, and it says it's football season. So this week, the sign came out and I knew, okay, here we go. It's football season. And it was a great week. My oldest son, Cole, is a sophomore in high school. And so I'm on cloud 9 as a dad right now. He is starting as a sophomore on the varsity team, and he had an interception on his in the first series of the first game. I jumped up so quick. I don't know if I should do it. I'm probably embarrassed. I don't know if I want to show the clip. If you go on my social, if you go search my social media feed, whether it's on Facebook, Instagram, you'll see the clip of my son with the interception. And I jumped up, and somebody commented on there and said, "Who's the little girl screaming in the background?" And unfortunately, it was me. I lost all composure and was so excited. But I tell you the story not to talk about football, but to say this is right now what I'm noticing is, and I think you're probably experiencing this too, but I don't know exactly where to find my joy in the future right now, because it feels like everything is a little bit touch and go or suspect. And so you think about, well, maybe after Labor Day, the kids are going to go back to school. In Indiana, at least in our school district, is not back in real school. And, people are looking forward to maybe to the NFL season, other things like that. We don't know what's going to keep going, what's going to get canceled. And so what I've noticed is as if I look too far into the future for hope or joy, is things begin to feel a little bit unsettling, and I can't guarantee them. And so what Friday Night Football has done for me, at least last week and so far this week, is it's training me to enjoy and embrace being present in the present moment. And for me, it's high school football. For you, it could be something else in your life. But here's what I'm going to encourage you to do. Is in a time of uncertainty, when we're not sure exactly what happens and when it's going to happen and what's guaranteed, is to not miss being present in the present. And for you, if it's football or it's a dinner out with friends, it's hanging out in the backyard with some neighbors, maybe it's a time of going on a walk and talking to God, or time alone, is be present in the present. And that's where I'm finding joy, and I'm appreciating that. So that's our first thought today on the podcast. I want to hit you, let's jump into the mailbag. Last week, we got to hear from Laura in Illinois. Laura, thanks for reaching out. And this week, it was just a quick little note I got from Instagram. Somebody just hit me up the Instagram comment about last week's episode with, actually it was part 1 of the episode with Davey Blackburn. If you've not gone back and listened to both those, part 1 and part 2, some of the most powerful content I think we've ever featured on the podcast. You say, Daron, what are we talking about? You've only had a podcast. This is episode 4. That's not really a big deal. Laugh track. There we go. I only said that so I could push one of the buttons. Anyway, I know that we only have 4 episodes of the Daron Earlewine Podcast, but we do have about 190 episodes if we add in all of what we did with radio theology and the Born to Be podcast before that. And if you haven't gone back and looked, there's some phenomenal guests and interviews through the past years that are on this same podcast feed on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your audio podcast. But the content that Davey shared, I thought was world class. I want you to go check that out. And I got a comment from Instagram that said, thanks for what you guys are doing. Love the interview with Davey Blackburn. And the person said, your podcasts have become my church. And that meant a lot to me. I want to say thanks to the guy that reached out and said that. It's a friend of mine who's going through some stuff right now and has processed through some pain, and I'm excited to see how he's processing that. And some of his pain came through his relationship with the institutionalized church or with the local church, and it means a lot that he's finding meaningful faith connections through what we're doing here on the podcast. And we didn't design this podcast isn't designed to be your church. And I want to encourage you that to look and find community where you can grow and you can learn to find accountability and encouragement in a community of folks that are following after who God's created them to be. But maybe you're at a place where you have been hurt by church, or it's just very foreign to you. And this is a kind of step 1 in maybe a reconnection journey or a connection journey for you to faith and to a faith community. I want to say welcome to the community. I'm glad that you have found it here. And my prayer and my hope is that it helps you continue to take steps to truly finding your place within the movement, within the kingdom, within the body of Christ, if you will, so you can find the true fulfillment in God's call in your life. So thanks for reaching out through the mailbag. And unfortunately, we said last week that one of the first people to comment or to like the podcast or to comment, leave a review, whether it's on YouTube or Spotify or an Apple Podcast, I was going to send you one of the new Daron Earlewine coffee mugs. Didn't get anybody this week. So this thing is just waiting for you. Okay. It's great. It's currently keeping my iced coffee very, very nice and icy. Very great. It actually makes things taste better. I don't know if a coffee cup can do it. This one does. Let me just get I was drinking that from like a portable coffee cup earlier, and it didn't taste as good as it did here in this beautiful Daron Earlewine mug. Anyway, hey, I want to send you one of these, and we want to grow this podcast in the community. So one of the first 5 people, we'll choose out of the first 5 that leave a review on one of wherever you get this podcast, we will choose one of you and mail you one of these mugs so you can drink hot or cold coffee, whatever you want when you're listening to the podcast, and we appreciate it. So let's jump into the question of the week. I hit you with it right off the top of the podcast today. It says, are people doing the best they can? And I came into this question a couple years ago through Brene Brown in her book, Rising Strong. If you've not read it, absolutely suggest you check this book out. It's Rising Strong is the book, How the Ability to Reset Transforms the Way We Live, Love, Parent, and Lead. Excuse me. And I love this book. When I read it, I actually love all of Brene's writing. But she tells a hilarious interaction of about a month in her life where she had to come to grips with the fact that she did not believe that people were actually doing the best they could. She had an example. It was a hilarious story where she's speaking, and then she ends up sharing a room with one of the other speakers. And this lady is, in her opinion, is just a train wreck. She's eating donuts and wiping like her donut hands on the couch, and it's this whole situation. And she goes to her counselor, and she's just flabbergasted. She can't believe this person. And her counselor brings her to this point of saying, Brene, do you feel like that she might just be doing the best that she can? And Brene rejects it aggressively and is like, there's no way she's doing the best she can. Like, anyone could do better than that. And then she unpacks, and I won't tell you the whole story, but over a month of interviewing tons of people, she comes to realize that the best perspective and starting point in our life, if we're going to actually be transformed ourselves and set ourselves up to love well and to be loved well, is to start from a place of assuming that everyone is doing the best they can. Because when you have an interaction with someone, right, all you know is how they're showing up in that moment. What you don't know is the journey, the pain, the struggle that has brought them to that moment. And what tends to happen is when we don't assume people are doing the best they can, we immediately assume that we are. And it's so easy to judge that person and think, what's their deal? What's the problem? We can judge them. We can discard them. We can make them invisible in our life. And it doesn't set us up to love well. And what we're going to get into, I'm excited about our guest interview this week, and this ties into her story. But my wife, Julie Earlewine, is the guest this week on the podcast, and I'm excited for you guys to hear a little of her life story. It's a powerful story, and it's going to bring you life. I know it's going to bring you hope, and I hope it brings you to a place of finding healing. And Julie, and what she shares, begins to unpack this with some pain from her childhood and coming to the place where she had to begin to believe that her biological father may have been doing the best he could in the situation in her life. And that's just a teaser for what's coming up. But it's a challenging place to get to, I think, because in our life, I think pain shapes a lot of what we're able to do. The best we can in a situation, I think, sometimes is either the culmination of positive or negative that has happened in us. And I say often in the podcast that fear is our enemy. And we want our life to matter. We want to make a difference in life, but fear is our enemy. And so often fear stirs up in our life by either bad choices we have made or because of the bad choices of others that have been made into our life. And when bad choices come into our life, pain usually comes into our life. And what is met there is fear. We're fear of being rejected. Maybe we're fear of punishment. Maybe we're fear of exposure. And this fear begins to drive us. And there's a quote that Brene shares a story in her book where she's at a bank and she's just talking to the bank teller, and there's a lady in front of her that's freaking out about what's going on with her bank account, and she's screaming and yelling, and she wants to see a manager, and she walks over, and Brene comes up to talk to the teller, and she says, what's wrong with that lady? I'm sure it doesn't look like she's doing the best she can. And the teller at the bank sticks up for this lady that is having this freak out moment. And he says this line to Brene that I thought was just so powerful. He says this, he says, people aren't themselves when they're scared. People aren't themselves when they're scared. In every day of our life, when we're trying to process through the pain, the fear, the courage necessary to show up as our best self, oftentimes we're dealing with feeling scared. Like I said, we're scared we're going to be rejected. We're scared we're not going to be enough, to accomplish enough. We're scared that other people aren't going to approve of who we are. We're afraid we're going to be exposed like we're some kind of an imposter or phony in our life. And when we're living scared, when fear is in control, we're not ourselves. And what that begins to do is it begins to actually affect our capacity to love, because it affects our capacity to be loved. And this is the bridge I want to build to Julie's interview, and I think it's going to really take you to great places as you listen today. But here's the deal. Fear is your enemy, but here's a thought that I had about where we get in that, and when we show up as less than our best self, even if we are doing the best we can in that moment. And the thought is this, is our capacity to love others is directly connected to our willingness to be loved. Let me say it again. Our capacity to love others is directly connected to our willingness to be loved. And that's where this connection or relationship with Jesus is so foundational to us actually being able to become who he created us to be. And there's a scripture that I want to frame the interview today that I want you to hear. Because in the story you're about to listen to with Julie, some of you may find yourself in the exact place that she did, or you've walked this through your childhood, a broken home, trying to figure out as a kid, did you cause this? Could you have fixed this? Trying to understand if you have a step parent, where does your loyalty to your step parents start, and where does your loyalty to your biological parents stop or start? And trying to walk through that whole journey and then figure out where God is in the process. And part of it is being able to get to the gracious place where you can truly say that And I think this takes a long time, and it takes God's help to see it. But where you can understand that as you walk through your life, that your parents and people in your life, that you can at least grace them with saying, you know what, I didn't love what happened, and I was hurt by what happened, but can I be gracious enough to say, you know what, I think they were doing the best they could in those moments. And this scripture jumped out to me this week, and I want to share it with you. It's Colossians chapter 3, verses 12 through 14. It's from the Passage Translation. Like I said earlier in another episode, I'm loving this translation of the Bible. It's bringing the word alive to me, and I hope it does for you. But listen to what this says as it frames the rest of the podcast today. You are always and dearly loved by God. Boom, foundational. Let's start there. Such a good place to start. And it's what you have to see as foundational to understand and allow that to give you the courage and the willingness to love others, because of the security it can bring you to understand that that's true. You are always means always, right? You are always and dearly loved by God. So here's the action. So robe yourself with virtues of God, since you have been divinely chosen to be holy. Listen to this. Now, this right here is huge. Be merciful as you endeavor to understand others, and be compassionate, showing kindness towards all. That principle right there, if you're looking at, if you in your brain, if I said that the first question, I said the question of the day, right, is, are people doing the best they can? If you immediately said, abso-freaking-lutely not. Like, I go through my day and I see people and I'm like, how you didn't get out of bed till 11, right? You can't eat healthy. You can't ever go for a walk. You can't and you all of a sudden you're giving them all the things that there's no way you're doing the best you can, because you're comparing them to how well you think you're doing in life usually, right? Is in that what we're probably not doing is being merciful as we endeavor to understand others. You may have heard the leadership principle, the relationship principle, to seek first to understand before you seek to be understood. And that is so vitally true, but so difficult to actually employ in your life. When you get in a situation and you feel wronged, you feel angry, you feel judgmental, it's very difficult to come to the place and go, you know what, before I react, before I respond, before I begin to let you understand how I view you or the situation, or what truth you need to see in this situation, to come to the place of go, you know what, let me first seek to understand, and let me do it from a merciful perspective, from a compassionate perspective. You know, I think about right now, this has popped into my head of what we're seeing in our world right now, as far as the racial divide and tenor of conversation on social media, and the pain and division that we see as a country. I wonder what would happen if all of us together came to the place and we said, you know what, here's where I want to start. I want to be merciful as I endeavor to understand others, and to be compassionate and show kindness towards all. What that might do to begin to bring healing to ourselves. Paul goes on and he says this: be gentle and humble, unoffendable in your patience with others. Goodness gracious. Unoffendable in your patience with others. That makes me think about what Davey said last week about how when we begin to trust God with our healing, that he can actually give us thick skin and soft hearts. To be at the place where you're unoffendable in your patience with others. And he goes on and says, tolerate the weaknesses of those in the family of faith, forgiving one another in the same way you have graciously been forgiven by Jesus Christ. If you find fault with someone, release this same gift of forgiveness to them. For love is supreme and must flow through each of these virtues. Love becomes the mark of true maturity. I love that scripture, and you're going to hear a story of true maturity as you listen to this interview that I did with my wife here about her journey. And she hits you with a quote at the very end that I'm going to get back to when we come back from the video. I want you to be able to just focus on what she says. As you walk through this journey of learning to identify herself through her healing and not through her pain. I can't wait for you to hear this interview that I did with my wife, Julie Earlewine, and the way that she began to see her healing and God's faithfulness through it. And after it, we'll jump back in and bring some closing thoughts to the interview. But enjoy and be impacted by this interview with my wife, Julie Earlewine. Julie, you're from North Carolina.
Yes, it's a wonderful place.
And kind of take us back to some of your, I guess, earliest like fun childhood memories. I mean, do they go in North Carolina or they start more like in Houston?
No, I would definitely say that most of my memories are of my life in North Carolina. I mean, all my childhood, all my growing up, I mean, all the way into college was like everything was there. You know, I really, in spite of all the backstory of my life, I had a really good childhood. You know, I was around, my parents raised me in the church, you know, and raised me around really awesome people. Like when I look at what would be considered a mentor over my life, like I was really blessed, you know, and a lot of our family memories are wrapped up in my church experience. And luckily mine was a positive one. Everybody doesn't have that story when you're, you know, my parents weren't in ministry. You know, my dad worked for the same company his entire life. My mom, the same. She worked part-time. She was always there after school when my brother and I came home. And my dad worked for the same company until just recently when he retired. So our life was pretty much consistent. Same church, you know, same friends, you know, same people. I mean, I'm lucky to have had the same best friend like my entire life. Like I don't know any different, you know? So, yeah, I mean, I had a really, like, especially on the outside looking in, I had a really great childhood.
And what's, I guess, unique is, and a part of your story that seems, I mean, I guess, even in our life and in our marriage, it's so like a different lifetime and a different complete narrative really of your life is talking about, you know, the journey with your, you know, your biological father. Mm-hmm. And most people, I mean, probably I would say the majority of people that probably know you in life, if they said, who's Julie's dad? It'd be like, Larry Cole.
Because he's my dad.
Because he's your dad.
Right.
And there's a bigger part of that story that I think we'll get to even, you know, of how that came full circle, you know, here later in life. But it's interesting because, you know, when you were very young, there was a pretty traumatic, you know, moment, at least that happened a lot, I mean, in your life as a child, but for your mom and that whole thing, but that's not something that necessarily has defined your life that much, I guess. I mean, I guess tell us a little bit of that story and kind of what you remember about those changes in your life early on.
It's really unique. I don't really remember. Basically, the story is my mom was married and got pregnant with me, and I was 2 years old, and my biological father was unfaithful to my mom, and my mom actually tried to do what it would take to restore the marriage. She was willing and he wasn't. And, you know, he made a decision to get a divorce. And at that point in time, life was so different than it is now. Like as far as when people get divorced and like, you know, he sort of completely stepped away. Like he didn't step away financially. And there were times I saw him, but he lived in a completely different state my entire upbringing. So my mom and my grandma and I, my Nana and I, my mom, we moved back to North Carolina at the time of the divorce. They lived in Houston. They came back and my mom recreated a life for herself here and for me. And through the course of that, you know, made decisions on who she dated in the next portion of her life that were so to my benefit that I think that that's why I was able to live a really like full childhood, unidentifying that loss in my life. Because as I've aged and gotten older, I realized that no matter what, no matter how great your parents are, because I have great parents, when something like that creates a vat in your life, like a loss, you can't understand it at 2. And even at 4, I never have been without a dad. Like my mom and dad were remarried when I was 4. My dad, I can remember the day when he sat me on the front doorstep of our house and asked me to call him dad. And I did. And it was an easy decision to make. I was 4. It was a great decision because he's amazing. But yeah, so I don't really remember the pain. I didn't really recognize the pain of it until I had a child myself.
I want to get to that, but I don't know that I've ever asked you this before, but we've talked a little bit about it, but did it feel like a tug of war or what was it like? Because I know that, I mean, your dad, Larry, came into your life at 4 and has been consistent until this day. He's an amazing man. And so you were having day in and day out life with dad, but then, Terry, your biological dad, like you said, he still was financially involved. He was around, in or out some, but what was that like as a kid trying to manage that and figure that out? Like, you're consistent and you're dad, but there's dad. And as a kid, what are some of the memories you have of trying to kind of figure that part out as your, because that does have, as far as when we talk about, becoming who we're born to be, there's, that our family relationships impact that. And so figuring out, like, who am I? Am I his daughter? I know that I'm loved, but I don't know. That's obviously deep questions, but I mean.
No, thank God for my counselor. Probably has helped me answer that question more appropriately. I would say that looking back at my life now, I created an ability within myself to be what I needed to be in whatever scenario I was in. So for instance, I remember this emotion of when I would go and have to visit Terry and struggling of what to verbally call him, because that's the only way as a child you could identify. Dad is dad, and then everybody else you call by name. Right. Mom is mom. You call mom, dad, and then everybody else you call by their name. And I remember one of the very struggles for me is when I would have to go and visit him and I'd have to go out of town and fly on an airplane by myself, is the whole time I would spend all my efforts trying to not call him anything. Like I would try to not put a single pronoun to him because I didn't want to call him, maybe not the word pronoun, I would call him hey, or I would get his attention without actually using dad or Terry.
And you remember thinking that?
I remember emotionally processing it to the point where I would be weary because I would not want to call it because I didn't want to hurt his feelings. I didn't want to disappoint him. I was always worried that I was disappointing him if I didn't call him dad, but he wasn't dad to me. So I didn't want to also give him the right to be called dad when my dad was my dad and he deserved the right of the title dad. Did
you also feel like if you did that you were being disloyal to Larry?
Oh, 100%. I could not, I remember Terry calling me on the phone and me making sure I never said the word dad to Terry, because in my brain, even as a child, I knew you aren't really what a dad is. But I didn't, you're young, you're processing, you haven't been to all the counseling that I've been to. You don't realize what that means or why you do that. And so what I've learned is that became a mechanism of my entire life. Is that I would create scenarios around everybody where nobody felt disappointed. Mm-hmm. So I didn't want Terry to feel disappointed if I didn't call him dad. I didn't want dad to feel disappointed if I called Terry dad, because I knew that dad was dad and Terry wasn't. But I still was always carrying all the emotions for everyone all the time.
Mm. Do you feel like, and obviously we're looking, it's, hindsight's always 20/20. So you're looking back and it's I can see that. And you have 40 years of wisdom. And I think about, and knowing yourself, you've gone through spiritual DNA, you've dug into understanding, you've been to counseling for years, but even you're an Enneagram 6. I don't know if you guys know about the Enneagram, but something we're going to be adding to spiritual DNA pretty soon. And, an Enneagram 6 is fiercely loyal. Yes. And so, as you look back, I can see obviously, signs of that being in there where it was I think it's your loyalty that drove you to not want to disappoint.
I'm sure there was a lot of that. I can remember the very moment that the loyalty stopped for him, for Terry.
All right, tell that story.
It was when Cole was born. I think because I realized
Cole's our oldest son.
He'll be 16 this summer. I remember for the very first time, I think that you have perspective of parenting when you are first allowed to parent. And I remember right after I had him, I kept struggling to leave him. I didn't want to leave him. My best friend, Leslie, who lives here in town with us. And, if my parents would come, and Daron's parents at the very beginning didn't live here locally. Yeah. So I would literally not leave. I would leave him with Daron and I would leave him with Leslie and I would leave him for a very brief amount of time. Because I was terrified, I've started to identify that I had this horrible feeling that he would think I would never come back. Hmm. And at that time, we were doing a Bible study that was sort of modeled after what they do in Alcoholics Anonymous, the 12-step program. And you can go through it for your alcoholism, but you can also go through it for just emotional things. Yeah. And you walk through it, and I had to start journaling. And all of a sudden, I started to identify, about the time Cole was 6 months old, that a lot of that fear of leaving him was out of that I didn't want him to ever think I would abandon him, to ever think that like I wouldn't come back.
And I can remember during that, I mean, obviously we'd all been married 3.5, 4 years at that point. And, being, for me, I'm 26, 27. I mean, I'm just trying to figure out life. And I remember you being, that being a big deal. And I can remember like not understanding it at all, because we hadn't really unpacked, or you had even really unpacked all these emotions.
No.
So then it was like, what's the deal? Why can't we go out for a date? Or why can't we, you know what I mean? It was an interesting thing. And so I guess just on that, like deeper, like you didn't want to ever feel alone, but you said there was a moment that loyalty stopped. Like what changed to say, you know what, like unpack that for us.
I think all my life I'd carried and I think this happens to kids of divorced parents all the time. And it's to no disservice to parents who choose to not, be together. But I think one of the things I see is that somewhere inside of a child, they identify that the divorce is somehow because of them, or they were, for me, I think it wasn't that I thought it was because of me, but it was more of I thought it was that it didn't matter at all to him. Like, you married, and I can see how you can walk away from a marriage. Like, people do it a lot. It is really hard for me to understand, like, how would you walk away, like, from your child? Mm-hmm. Like, that's literally, like, I can't imagine divorcing you. I never would. I mean, we work really hard. I mean, some days maybe I might want to choke him, but like, I just literally cannot imagine missing a single moment of my child's life. And I think what happened was when I started watching all these things of Cole's life, whether it was first words, first steps, first time he set up, and I was thinking, yes, you were there till he was there around till I was 2, sort of. I mean, he was there and they were married. Then he was around when I was little. And I've been told that he absolutely adored me when I was little. It wasn't like he wasn't present then.
Right.
But still, I just started for the first time. I think my eyes became open to the fact of, like, you chose to miss things. I didn't choose for you to miss them. It was your choice. You didn't have to live somewhere else. You didn't have to not call for 6 months, sometimes 6 weeks, sometimes not see me for 3 years at times. Like, that's a choice. As an adult, you have choices. As a child, you have no choices. And so here I have this child of my own that I've never felt that kind of love in my whole life for, and thinking, I wouldn't miss a single minute of your life. So how would someone do that to me? And at that point, I was like, this isn't about me. Like, I didn't choose for him to leave. He chose to leave me. And I can't keep trying, because I always felt like I was the one holding on to that relationship. I was the one feeling like I should call. I should check in. I should make sure he's okay. And finally, I was like, through a lot of counseling, I realized that I didn't feel that way anymore. That parenting is our job, our gift to get to be a part of. I mean, I feel like being a mom has been one of the greatest things I've ever given, an experience like none other. So it was very challenging for me to think, you just chose to not be there.
Do you think that has some, like, I think there's those moments as we're growing up where, like, our life is the normal thing. Like, this is just what it was. And you have all your presuppositions and your beliefs and things that have been built by that. And then you become an adult, and then you have those moments where you realize, like, wait a second, like, time out. No, like, it's not just what it was. Like, you literally were making these, like, as an adult, you see their choices as an adult. Yes. And then you realize, like,
you made those choices.
You made those choices. This wasn't like, oh, well, that was just how my life was. It was like, no, that's how my life was because you literally made it that way. So that definitely fueled you to be a more present mom and never want, the boys to feel that, which there's no doubt. I've seen that now for 15 and a half years in your parenting and your mothering. What did it do for you to pull the loyalty back and go, you're not going to get that part anymore because honestly, you don't deserve it. You didn't earn it. Was that freeing? Was there still some guilt? Like, what did that feel like?
Well, I don't think in the moment when I made those choices there was guilt, because I think that's when the first time I ever felt the pain from it. So I think in the beginning it was pain. You know, it was like, oh, like that's really sad for you. Actually, I actually felt sadness, almost like you missed that. Like you missed everything. Like that's super sad, like for you, you know, and super great for my mom and dad, you know, and, it started to make sense. One of the things I think that I started to realize, and I had counselors say this to me, and it was, this came, because revelations come in a moment, but they take over time to learn them. So as I've gone through parenting the boys and raising them, I've grown through more and more. And one of the things is that, and this is to his credit, to my biological father's credit, is I've learned that everybody's threshold is different. You know, their threshold of their capacity to love is different. And a lot of that comes out of their pain of what they went through as a child. So my mom and dad's capacity was way up here to love me and to show their love, not just love me, because people can love someone and not show it very well. Their capacity to love me was like so high I can hardly reach, you know. He absolutely loved me. I believe that. But his capacity to show that love and to give that love was much lower based on what he'd gone through in his past. Pain of his past. He lost his mom very young. His father was verbally and physically abusive. And after he was 16, he basically raised himself. So if I think about Cole leaving now and being on his own for the rest of his life, it's going to make you a very inward person. But those perspectives have come now through years of learning and through that wanting to change the past of the future of our family's generations to come. So I learned a lot about that capacity that he tried probably to the capacity he was capable of. And I think by God's grace and God's goodness, he saw that. And when my mom made decisions to honor God with her whole life, she honored God with my dad. And then we became this family that would be able to make a difference for the kingdom. And I was raised in a home that really believed in God first and family second and everything else after that.
I can remember back one of the first times I started getting into Brene Brown, reading her books. I remember her, one of the chapters, and I think maybe it was in Daring Greatly, or I can't remember which book it was in, but she talked about coming to that conclusion that people, like, they're doing the best they can. Yeah. And she talked about how she really struggled to really believe that. And I can remember the first time, this would have been during, I think, some of this season as you're unpacking something, because it was a long time ago that I read this. And I remember one of the first times coming to you and talking about it. And I remember you being like, your response reminded me of Brene's, of like, you know what I mean? I don't think people are doing the best they can. Like, they could do better.
No, most of the time I don't think people are doing the best they can.
But,
terrible.
But you're saying you came to that conclusion, at least with your biological dad. And I think, I'm wondering, did that epiphany and beginning to embrace that, you know, was that something that God used to help you actually be able to soften and to receive other people, you know, in a higher degree of love and acceptance when they are letting you down?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think we were going through not just with him, like our life was sort of kind of like two derailed trains with a lot of things happening, like a lot at one time in our life, whether it was religious things were letting us down, or
you mean ours?
Our life
ours, okay.
Was going through a lot of derailing and sort of then, you know, unpacking all of the debris at the end and seeing what was left of us after it was all settled. And I think throughout all of that, colliding at the same time, I've been able to see more clearly that, like, there is no, like, everyone's coming at something differently. You know, everyone has a story that makes their story what it is today. And those stories, you don't know them all. And you can't assume upon someone in any way, shape, or form, because you 9 times out of 10 don't know the story behind them. And so I think that that's where a lot of it came out of, is that I saw it in that scenario. Like, in some ways, Terry made a decision by stepping back. He allowed me to have a better life. He allowed me to have a more normal per se life. I don't know if there's any normal anymore, but I think in that time of life and that season and that whatever, he had convinced himself he was giving me a better life. And that, to me, there's a lot of love in that. And that I've had to allow myself to receive, it wasn't like he ever acted like he didn't care about me. It wasn't like he didn't, he was like emotionally abusive or any of those things. He wasn't like legitimately when I was with him. I think me visiting him was hard because I think in those times and seasons when I visited him, he realized what he lost, and what happens when you visit someone like that in those scenarios is that I realized what I already had. So I realized I already have, I have so much, and as I got older, I would see, oh, I already have so much. And I think he would realize, oh, I miss so much.
Wow. That's profound.
I don't know. That's just, I can remember specific conversations with him, me having to leave him. And when I was little, it was harder for me to leave him. As I got older, it was harder for him. It was harder on him for me to leave him. Didn't say that in the right way.
Yeah. Makes me think about, one of the things I talk about often that I, learned from Kevin Myers about the pain of discipline or the pain of regret.
Yeah.
Is, that early on in life, he didn't choose the pain of discipline and the vows and things that he made. And then had a lifetime of dealing with the pain, of regret. Mm-hmm. And,
that's really sad. But then I look at my dad and think he chose so much discipline by choosing to treat me like, my dad's never treated me one day like a stepdaughter. We don't even use that term. That sounds like we don't even act like that's a real term. And, he chose so much discipline in being a dad to me and, to my brother, which my brother and my mom had, Joe is my dad's biological son. But it's, I never felt different. I never felt different than Joe. I never felt like when people see us, like people didn't know. Unless you knew our stories of the past, if you met us up front, you didn't know. Yeah. And that was the beauty of my family. My dad chose a lot of discipline in that. And I don't think my dad has a lot of regret, from that. I think he has a lot of gifts. Mm-hmm. So it proves that true.
So I want to skip ahead a little bit, Julie, to just recently, actually, there was an event that Larry, your dad, took that I think really became, from being your husband and watching, was an amazing healing moment for you that actually came on the tail end. Skip ahead of the story. Your biological father died a few years ago, and it kind of left this back and forth. There was a finality to that, and then your dad Larry stepped in and did a pretty amazing thing. So talk about that.
Yeah, my biological father I hadn't spoken with him for a series of years. It was sort of a part of that decision in my life where I sort of put the ball in his court. And it didn't always play out the way I thought maybe it would. Maybe if I didn't call, he would call. And he got really ill, sort of like an extreme form of dementia. It was really a tragic thing. And called on my 40th birthday. And I hadn't seen him I was pregnant with Knox. Mm. So it had been a really long time the last time I'd seen him. Knox is our youngest son. He's almost 10. And I had not seen him. And so they called and he was in poor health. And I spent the next 18 months, I'd gone and seen him. I went to see him twice. Mm. And some might say this is selfish, but I went because sure, I would have loved to have made something like this magical story of that becoming totally made right. But he wasn't in the mental health to be able to make it right. But I went for myself because I've grown enough to know that living with regret and not submitting forgiveness back to a person is not worth living. So he became very ill and I went and saw him a few times. I checked in, I would call his wife and check in and followed through all that. And then he passed away in February a few years ago. And then that created a really weird emotional thing for me for about a year. It was just really peculiar, like feeling. And it was a journey that I started going on where my counselor taught me to, like, I wasn't really mourning the actual death. I was mourning the death of everything that he missed my whole life. So I spent that next year sort of mourning all the times he died in my life when he wasn't there. Like when you weren't at my dance recital, or when you weren't at my Christmas play, or when you weren't at this and that, you know, but then also having this unbelievable comfort of like, but I still had my dad. He was at everything, you know, he didn't miss anything. Like he was there every day. He was there every time a boy broke my heart. He was there every time I wrecked a car and he would somehow make my mom not lose her mind. Or then the time that I made poor decisions in 8th grade and he just looked down and said, you really messed up, as my mom was like freaking out, screaming at me, calling the pastor to the house. Like dad was such a rock through my whole life. He was a very calm, like, you know him, he's a very calm, chill dude. Anyway, mom and dad actually were working on their wills, and they're in their 70s, and they were like getting all of their like final affairs in order, and they were meeting with the lawyer, and they wanted to put me as the, like, what do you call it? Like the main person on the will. Like I'm the person who's like in charge of their estate whenever they have to have, what's it called? Anyway, executor.
I was going to say executioner.
No, they're not. I'm not going to be an executioner, mom and dad, I promise. Executor of the will to manage the, you know, all their end of life stuff. And they would not list me as my dad's daughter on the will. And he was like, what are you talking about? Like, she's my daughter. He's like, well, biologically, like, she's not your daughter. Like, she's legally not your daughter. I can't list her. I won't list her in the will as your daughter. She can still do it, but I won't list her as your daughter. And he was like, I don't like that. He's like, I don't want it that way. And she's like, well, there's no way. The only way you could do it is if you adopt her, and you're probably not going to adopt her. You know, her biological father would have to sign off on that, and she's in her 40s. And my mom's like, well, actually, her biological father passed away a few years ago. And so it was the cutest my parents live in North Carolina. It was like literally the cutest phone call of my whole entire life. My parents figured out FaceTime. It was probably one of the first times they figured out FaceTime. And they called, and they're sitting at the kitchen table. And my dad was like, I've wanted to do this your whole life. But he was like, I would like for you to let me adopt you. And for you to be all mine. And in that single moment, I literally felt like my whole life, like all of the healing and all of the hurting and all the protecting I had done over our boys to make sure they knew they would never be abandoned or left without. It all came full circle. So I was 42. Is that right? Because I was 42 and my dad adopted me. And so now I'm all his. I have a birth certificate that proves it. And it sounds kind of silly, you know, you're 40, but it doesn't matter how old you are. You know, when you finally feel like your whole life is what it was always meant to be, even if it's on a paper, like that's what we always were. It didn't, what we always were. It actually didn't change any of the 38 years before that, but it just confirmed them all. It confirmed everything my dad was. It confirmed everything our family was. It confirmed everything that God had done to look over my life and say, I have a plan. I have a plan for her. And I told Daron once, right after Terry died, that one of the struggles was that my biological father and my mom, they had me. And then they got a divorce. And then, you know, my mom and my dad, they got married and they had my brother. And they did a great job of me always being a part of their family. It was never a question that I wasn't. And then Terry had gone on and he had his life over here. And there were days I really struggled that I've always sort of felt like I lived my life on this island alone, but, you know, attached to bridges to other people. And, you know, Daron said to me, you know, you've not been on an island alone. You've been married to me for 20 years. And the beauty of God's plan was that, like, he oversaw everything with my mom to get her to my dad, to take care of me, to get me to Daron, so that we could create an island for our family, that we are doing the best we can, fighting as hard as we can to make it whole and strong and honoring, and for our boys to be raised to create families that love people and love Jesus. And, you know, that's, people ask me a lot of times, like, what's your ministry? Like, what do you do? Like, what is your calling? You know, we talked about it right before this, but I think when I sit here and talk about this today, I think my ultimate calling has been to restore a generation of family within my family. And God used my dad adopting me to solidify that. And now it's just who I am. I'm just Julie Cole Earlewine, and, you know, thankful for that.
I think it's beautiful, babe. And I think the thing about it that stands out to me is, like, and I don't know that I've made this connection, is that, you know, if someone to ask, one of your girlfriends were to ask, you know, like, you know, what's the best thing about Julie? I mean, I remember one of your friends, Sherry, saying, like, Julie, I think one of your gifts is, like, you're like somebody's best friend. You're an amazing friend. And that comes through in that loyalty and that faithfulness that you show to the people that you love, that you show to me, that you show the boys, that you show people that you love and that you let into your life. And if people know you, that you're not letting people in right away.
No.
But sorry. I think it's because once they get inside your circle of trust, you so fiercely protect and are faithful to them that you don't take that lightly. And I don't know that I necessarily put that together so much, of how much I really think there's a testament to Larry, to your dad, that you saw what, even in the midst of an imperfect situation, even in the midst of some pain and the awkward, it was his faithfulness and his loyalty that created an ability. And then obviously the adoption thing, it brings it all full circle. But
the interesting thing about that is my dad's an Enneagram 6, and so is my brother. All three of us test Enneagram 6, you know, and interesting, that loyalty to us and to our family.
Yeah.
And above all else to Jesus, because I've watched my dad be loyal and faithful to Jesus his whole life.
So this is episode 1. I'm going to convince Julie to do a bunch more of these, and we'll have fun with them as our dog joins us. Do you want to come up here and be part of the podcast? Come on, get up here. This is Theo, the dog. He's loyal as well.
He's probably worried because I'm scary.
Yeah. Why is mom crying? So we'll have Julie back on the podcast again. But Julie, I guess as we wrap it up, if there's somebody on here and they've had this similar kind of, you know, upbringing, and maybe they're in the midst of it. They don't have the, you know, biological dad, or, you know, the, you know, dad adopts me, you know, moment. They're in the midst of trying to figure out that process. What's a word of encouragement to give them as far as walking through this?
I think, you know, maybe your story isn't always the same, but I think that one of the things that I would say is first of all, I would say to go to a counselor, because they really do make a difference. But I think one of the things is to learn and to ask God to help you to identify yourself outside of your pain. You know, so many times we identify ourselves out of the pain, and we can sit in it so long that it becomes what defines us. But really, the greatest form of identification is going to come out of the healing that we found. And when we identify in the healing, then we become really who He wants us to be, who we are born to be. And I would the people around you that have loved you well through it, make sure you tell them. And the people that maybe didn't love you well, still tell them you love them, because you don't really want the pain of regret.
Oh, and we're back, friends. Every week I can't take it. I got to find reasons to use the effect. Oh my goodness, how good is Julie? I mean, if you were thinking right away, Daron really married up, you are correct, my friends. Hello. All right, there we go. No, and hey, I appreciate your graciousness. We recorded that. It fits perfect, right? We were doing the best we could. It was a pandemic. We're trying to record at home, set up the iPhone. I don't know if you had to move past the ice maker making noise, and that our dog joined us, Theo, and maybe you just felt like you were at home in the living room with us. I hope that was the emotion you had, because that's what you were doing. If you listen to this on audio, go back and watch the YouTube one. You can see Theo completely ruin the interview at the end, but he's a sweet dog. But I tell you what, guys, one of the quotes that Julie hit us with at the end there, where she talked about identifying ourselves outside of our pain and identifying in the healing. That right there is worth the whole podcast, because here is what all of us have. We all have pain. Your story can be different. It is probably different than Julie's, but you may be listening and going, oh my gosh, that is my exact story. And you may find yourself, like many of us do, caught between identifying ourselves in our pain or allowing God to begin to tell a different story in our life. It's been great to watch Julie, as my wife, work through this. And if you notice in the story, right, she's in her 40s. Like, this is a 40-year story. And I learned this principle many years ago by Wayne Jacobson, when he said that God's not in a hurry. And that truth gives me peace, but I also kind of hate it. I'm not a real patient guy, and when I identify pain or things that need to be fixed in my life, I want them fixed yesterday. I don't want to know that God's like, you know what, son, like that scripture we read, right? When God says, hey, here's the deal. I love you. You're always dearly loved. So we're not working on acceptance or love here. That's already done. And so I'm not in a hurry, because as I work with you, right, I mercifully endeavor to understand you. I already do. I'm compassionate. I show kindness to you. I'm gentle. I'm humble. Watch this. God is unoffendable in his patience with us. Wow. Okay. We didn't mean to get emotional here on the podcast. Man, think about that. God is unoffendable in his patience with you. You see, if you have something that you're working through, as Julie talked about, there's a place of pain. And as we already said, right, when we're scared, when we're fearful, when we're dealing with pain, we're not ourselves. And you may have an action, a reaction, an addiction, something that's happening, maybe that's causing other people pain in your life. And you're afraid that as you're figuring that out, as you're currently doing the best you can, that maybe God is offended with your process. You see, friend, the process to become who you were born to be is a lifelong one, and God's not in a hurry. The process is in no way connected to his affection or acceptance of you. You see, you are always and you're dearly loved. He's tolerating your weaknesses. He's unoffendable in his patience with you. Because what he wants to lead you to do is what Julie's talking about here, is he wants to bring you to a place where you no longer identify who you are by your pain, but you identify yourself by your healing. And see, that makes your life a story of hope. And you know what everyone around you needs? Stories of hope. Because I promise you, there's someone within your sphere of life, because you see, God has created you on purpose and for purpose, and a big purpose that you're created for is love. We talk a lot here in the podcast and in Spiritual DNA about finding your gifts and your talents and your abilities, of how that can allow you to leverage that for personal and professional gain and impact, what jobs and careers. But the bottom line, the foundational purpose of all of our lives, because we're created in the image of God, who is love in his essence. That's who he is. Your purpose is to love. And one of the best ways that you can love others is as you begin to identify in the healing that God has brought in your life, where you don't lead with your pain. You say, yeah, here's the deal. There's been pain in my life, but God has been able to heal that. And in the process of healing, and that's not maybe, it is going to be as you can look back to the places and to the people who have caused you pain and struggle, and learn to understand them and say, you know what? As painful as it is, I have to realize that they may have been doing the best they could have in that moment. Was it the best for you? Maybe not. But as you can begin to forgive and begin to show compassion for where they were in those moments, God can use it to begin to unlock compassion and healing in your life. We interviewed Paul Young, the co-author of The Shack, many years ago on the podcast, and it's a great interview. You can go back and look at the archives. And Paul said a powerful statement. He said it took him 50 years to wipe the face of his dad off the face of God. And when he said that, it hit me like a ton of bricks, and I realized that for so many people, that's where they are. And I'm so proud of my wife in the process that she's gone through and the way she's allowed God to bring healing into her life, because in the failures of her earthly father, she has not allowed those to be the way she sees God. It didn't take her 50 years to wipe the face of her father off the face of God, but maybe that's where you're at. And maybe the thing that is keeping you from becoming who you were born to be is fear. It's fear that in forgiving, somehow you're going to lose power. It's fear that if you offer someone compassion that has hurt you, that somehow it gives them more power in your life. What I want you to hear, friend, is this, is that your path to healing and your path to freedom is through forgiveness. It's through compassion. Because, as we already said, because you are always and dearly loved by God. So robe yourself with the virtues of God, since you've been divinely chosen to be holy. And be merciful as you endeavor to understand others, and be compassionate, showing kindness towards all. Be gentle and humble, unoffendable in your patience with others, and tolerate the weaknesses of those in the family of faith, forgiving one another in the same way you have been graciously forgiven by Jesus Christ. And if you find fault with someone, which you will, release the same gift of forgiveness to them, for love is supreme and must flow through each of these virtues. Love becomes the mark of true maturity. Wow. We can end it right there. Love becomes the mark of true maturity. I'm excited for your journey, friend, and I count it an absolute honor to walk it with you. God has created you on purpose and for a purpose, and that purpose is to love, to become mature, to become made whole, to identify in your healing so you can bring hope to others. And I can't wait to see that happen. If you got questions about the podcast today, or maybe something that came up in this episode, and you say, hey, could you talk a little more about this? I could use some help with this. Please reach out to me. It's just Daron@blackbirdmission.com is where you can email me. You can reach out to me through all the social media platforms, or just leave a comment on the podcast, whether it be through YouTube or through wherever you get your audio ones. Because I'd love to help you in this journey. We're together, becoming who God's created us to be. And it's a true honor to walk in this with you. And I can't wait to see you continue to take steps to identify in your healing and not in your pain. Because guess what? You can't do anything about your past, but you can do something about your healing, and you can trust God to rewrite your future. And that's where we're going, because there's a future that needs to be created. And I say those that have been healed and brought to wholeness, grab the pens along with God and begin to rewrite and to write the future that we all get to live in. My friends, it is an absolute joy each and every week to host you in this podcast. Thanks for sharing it. Thanks for the comments. Thanks for the reviews, the subscriptions. And if you got a friend that needs the message of this podcast episode, maybe they need to hear Julie's message. Maybe they need to know that you see them doing the best they can in this moment. Share it with them, and it'd mean the world to us. God bless you. Have a beautiful week. And until we see you or talk to you next week, remember these three things. God is near you, not far away. God is for you, not against you. And God has created you on purpose and for a purpose. This is the Daron Earlewine Podcast. We'll talk to you next week.